Hello Internet, this video is the final video in this series where we complete the assembly of the dial set Compur shutter. Uh, I'll also indicate where to lubricate the shutter because even though it does not need much, there are key points that do need some lubrication to keep the shutter itself moving accurately and smoothly. Okay, so here I'm taking the main case, making sure that there's no debris or anything in it, and aligning the mechanism plate. Those two pins do have recesses in the main case. And here I'm just pulling out any threads of cotton or any random hairs that fell in, giving it a quick blast with the rocket blower, again knocking loose any random dust or debris that may have fallen in. Yeah, just making sure that's fully seated there. And again, chasing threads of cotton. And here I'm arranging the spring for going in underneath the barrel arm, as well as onto the internal levers there. And towards the end of the video here, I'm going to actually show a close-up of the assembled mechanism plate. You can see here the spring itself actually came off of the pivot post. But in that close-up, I'll actually point out the various springs that need to be set, as well as lubrication points. And here with the spring, I'm just making sure that the shape of the spring is correct, as it did look to have gotten twisted out of shape a little bit at some point in its life. And at this point, I just decided that it's too difficult with the mechanism plate in the case to get that spring on. So I'm trying it here with that mechanism plate out of the case. As you can see, trying to get that spring on, it can run away and fling across the table or the room, depending on where you're at when it snaps away. So here I'm just working on getting that spring in place um, underneath the barrel arm. I'm attempting to get that put back into the mechanism plate. And once that's aligned and locks back in, you can see there I'm just pointing out the orientation of the shutter release to the um, release cable, because that lever there just links the release cable to the release lever. And putting in the 4 case screws, being certain to remember which one was the shorter of them, which that first one I put in was the shortest of the 4, if only by slight. It is important, of course, to keep track of that, because if you put a longer one in, it could interfere with the shutter. And if you try to put a smaller one in where a longer one goes, it may not fully engage, which could cause stripping of the hole or the screw, or just not hold the parts together. Now, in this particular shutter, the big importance is that short one, so it does not interfere with the mechanism itself. And I'm just going through and making sure that those are all tight and secure. And the wavy washer for the final lever here, which the job of this lever is to determine which mode the shutter is in, if it's going to be in bulb, timer, or interval. Hence the letters um, on the mode select arm, the TBI. And I'm just making sure that everything is in position and lying flat. And the retaining screw for that. I'm just making sure that it's moving appropriately through the different steps, and then checking the action of the shutter itself before tightening down the retaining screw. And just preliminary, making sure that the shutter is working in time and bulb mode. Um, just nudging the mode select lever with my finger as I move the shutter release. Okay, and this is the point where you would put the front cover on. And of course, making sure to get the screws in the right location. First one there that I'm having some difficulty getting in uh, is the longer of the screws, and the shorter one goes through the shutter release lever. And here's the mode select lever, um, sorry, mode select dial with its wavy washer already in place. And is making sure that with the shutter set to time that the dial is also in that location before putting it on, and then screwing that in there. Now at this point I have not shown the full lubrication of the shutter. Um, at this point I did my graphite had not yet come in, but I'm just making sure that the general mechanism is working. Here I'm reattaching the caulking lever. And setting it to interval, cocking it, and pressing the shutter release. You can see it winds down. And this plate locks in with a small stud. This S-shaped bit, which does have a proper orientation, there is a nubbin on top, a small bump that does go up. The S-shape does set the actual time of the shutter, and the small bump on that S plate does correlate with that second plate. That second plate helps with the timing by moving that second lever um, as it rides along the edge there. And the shutter speed select dial has a post that does go through both of those, and that would go on with its wavy washer and its spring. Sorry, its screw. Yeah, the wavy washer, of course, would work as a spring to keep tension on that portion of the mechanism, and the screw itself would just maintain the location of the dial. The dial itself has numbering across that upper edge to indicate the shutter speed. And here I had set it to the fastest and then the slowest. Unfortunately, I had forgotten to set a couple springs inside, uh, which here momentarily I'll be getting to that graphic. Uh, it's just a still of the shutter, and I'll point those out. Okay, so here you can see the inside of the shutter. This is without the front plate on, obviously. Now here I've highlighted in blue. This is that spring that I had initially forgotten. You can see just the tail end underneath that brass rivet. Without that tension there, the mechanism, as you saw, will not properly time to the slower shutter speeds. Now here, highlighted in red, you see the lower springs. The one I was fighting with, you can see on the lower left, and then the upper right is the spring going underneath the barrel arm. Underneath that arm is a post that will hook into. It can be a little bit difficult to get that in place. And what you cannot see is just to the right of that barrel arm spring is a tension spring um, for the mode select lever uh, that helps with it moving smoothly and evenly. And in this image, I have highlighted the pivots of the pinion wheels as well as the locations for applying graphite. The green on the pinion wheels is where you would place just the barest amount of oil, and then all of the cyan locations is where you would put the graphite. Once you put the graphite into the shutter, you would then move the shutter back and forth, opening, closing the shutter, caulking and triggering the shutter itself, just to make sure all the graphite is worked through the system. You would then come back in with the rocket blower to blow out any excess graphite, because any excess graphite, of course, will dirty your shutter blades, dirty the glass uh, in the lens groupings, as well as potentially slow the shutter and jam it up. Okay, and here I've gone back in, I've verified that spring, which was the primary culprit, with the shutter. At this point, my graphite had come in, and so I was able to fully lubricate the shutter, and as you can see, it now fully functions. Now I'm putting the lens groupings back in, the rear and front groupings. Um, and with that, the shutter would be ready to go back into the camera. Unfortunately, I did get them backwards at first, but I did fix that. Uh, Again, once those groupings are back in place, the shutter would be ready to go back into the camera and live out its life. So I do thank you very much for following along with the series, anyone who may have, and I do hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope this helped.